Bring a Trailer Podcast. Welcome to the Bring a Trailer Podcast. I'm Randy Nonnenberg, co-founder of BAT. Been here since 2007, and we've been charging on, and now we have a super cool podcast today. One of our best ones. I'm super excited. We have Hannah Elliott with us from Bloomberg. She is a journalist, writer in the automotive space, and covers a lot of super interesting events, has covered BAT in the past. Just got back from an amazing event in Europe that we want to hear all about, and covers vehicle releases, modern cars, classic cars, a lot of things happening in the car space. Hannah, welcome. Super excited to have you.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Randy.
Well, we've gotten to talk a couple times here on some of these topics because there's kind of a funny background context. We had an awesome podcast where we sat down and I think we spoke for 45 or 50 minutes about all these invigorating topics about a month ago, and I neglected to record the podcast. So you and I walked away from that saying, okay, I guess that was the practice run.
You know, I'm pretty sure we solved all the world's problems in that. And of course, now it's lost. So we're going to have to redo it again. But I'm pretty sure that was, like the most brilliant we've ever been. But
nobody will ever know but us.
No one will know, but we know. It was brilliant. And I have to say that is honestly my worst nightmare as someone who records a lot of interviews and conversations. So I have so much empathy. It is a nightmare scenario. So
well, thankfully, we are not making our money on being professional podcasters. We're doing it with auctions and cars, but you are doing things in the journalistic space and interesting stuff that I want to talk about. So anyway, I wanted to say thank you for returning and doing round two.
I'm so happy to.
And I think everybody's going to be excited to hear about stuff. So some of the things we chatted about last time that I found super interesting was you shared sort of your history and how you got into journalism and then how you got into the sort of car beat, as you called it. But first off, journalism, I think we were chatting about, was that always the dream from Hannah at a young age to be a journalist?
Yeah, it was not. I was one of those kids that was really into sports, and I love reading, and I liked playing with animals. Cars were certainly not in my childhood at all, and journalism didn't really seem like a real job to me. It seemed like something from the 1940s that like gumshoes did with that press card and their fedora hat. I didn't really aspire to it, but it's funny how life works out. And when I was in college, I'd always loved reading and writing, and I sort of didn't know what to do, but there came a point where you sort of have to declare a major. And my dad just kind of said, well, why don't you, take some journalism classes. You like reading and writing. And honestly, it was just the type of thing where it was like, well, this is easy. I can do it. It's easy enough. And I'm curious enough. And so that's sort of how I fell into it. And it kind of is one of those things that you realize, hey, just because something comes easy to you doesn't mean that it's not valuable. And that's like a sign that you should probably do more of it. I kind of thought, well, it comes not to say it's easy, but it comes naturally to me. I'm really curious and I like learning and I like talking to people about things. And so it just came natural. And somehow I didn't think that was special. And then you start to realize, oh no, that's what makes it special for you, because not everyone likes it or can do it. So I sort of realized, oh, this is actually, it probably took me 10 years, honestly, working as a journalist before I really thought, oh yeah, this is what I'm good at. This is my career. So it was a slow revelation, I would say, but a good one.
Definitely a good one. And where did that lead you? Where were those 10 years? Out of school? You took some smaller, I don't imagine you rolled straight into Bloomberg to the front page. Like how did it work?
No, I didn't. That would have been weird and wild if I did. No, I went to school at Baylor University in Texas, and I actually chose Baylor for a host of reasons, none of which had to do with journalism. I have a lot of family in Texas, and I had aunts and uncles who went to Rice and SMU and Baylor. So we have this like Texas private school tradition. My dad went to Rice, and Baylor had a great track team, and I wanted to walk on and try to do track and cross country, which I did for a little bit there. So that was really the appeal. I grew up in Oregon. I just wanted to go somewhere different and with warm weather, and that seemed exciting and fun. So those were all the reasons I went to Baylor. And while I was at Baylor, I interned for a news service based in Florida, writing about politics and religion. And to make a long story short, after I interned there, I was hired after I graduated to continue working for this news service writing about politics and religion, which was really cool. And I got to spend time in DC. I got to be in Congress, and I learned a lot that way. And then moved to New York. At the time, I was married to someone in finance. So we moved to New York together, which made sense for both of our careers. We're both really young. And I made a deal with my editor at the time that if he let me move to New York and keep my job writing about politics and religion, if I kept it for a year, then no harm, no foul if I then pursued something else in New York. He was a smart guy. He kind of realized when she gets to New York, she's going to want to do other things. So long story short, I moved to New York and kept writing about that. But then I was looking for different jobs, and I saw on a Craigslist an ad for working at Forbes magazine as the assistant to the automotive editor. And I did not know a single thing about cars. I honestly found them a little bit boring, and I kind of thought all cars are the same. You drive them, and as long as they work, they're fine. But I knew that Forbes was a really good brand, and I was ambitious enough to think, well, I'm going to try to get my nose in there, and then I'll figure it out once I get inside. I'll, leverage to something else. And the editor who hired me was he's a great editor and a great person, and he told me, look, it doesn't matter that you don't know anything about cars. What matters is that you've been trained as a journalist and a communicator. I can teach you the beat of cars, because really it's a beat like any other beat: sports, beauty, tech. You learn the beat, you learn the contacts. The more important thing is that you understand the fundamentals of journalism and communication. So I was hired, and then after about 18 months, the editor who hired me was laid off. This was in 2008 when everything was really going south, and Forbes had a round of layoffs. And he was expensive, and I was cheap labor. So unfortunately, he was laid off. He's done great for himself since. But the thing is, they laid off the automotive editor, and then they realized, well, we still want car content. And it was like, we just fired the guy who does cars. But oh wait, this young reporter who was really inexpensive to hire, she's been doing it a little bit. Let's get her to do some more of it. So I sort of rolled my eyes and started doing more and more car coverage, and I haven't stopped. I guess, to make a long story short, I really fell into it. But what I've learned since then, and that was over 15 years ago. I don't want to say 20 years yet, but we're nearing 20 years. And I've really realized that cars are so interesting, fascinating. And at this moment in the car industry, I really think we are at the most exciting time period since cars started, basically 100 years ago, 100 plus years ago. I mean, this time is fascinating, and cars touch on so many other interesting industries. This is a long answer to your question, Randy, but to sum it up, it was not on purpose that I got involved in journalism or car journalism, but it has been a wonderful career. And I actually think it's been, for me, an advantage to not have a background in cars, because when I first started out, I had no qualms about asking what might have been considered dumb questions, because I didn't care. I didn't come from cars anyway. I have no baggage. I had no allegiances. I wasn't a Ford person or a GM person, or I was a non-person. And that actually really freed me up. I mean, of course, I know how to drive, and I actually even knew how to drive a stick that I learned on my dad's old Ford truck. But to me, it was an advantage, I think, because I came at it from a very different perspective. And for the Bloomberg audience, this will wrap your question up in a bow. For the Bloomberg audience, it's important that we communicate in a way that appeals to people who might be reading about watches and cars and art and wine. And their most precious commodity is not money, it's time. So it's really important for me to be able to speak to a reader who, if they want to do a deep dive and get really technical, they can go to Motor Trend or Road and Track or any of the car mags. But for someone who wants a succinct, clever, hopefully, well-rounded take on something, who might be reading about other luxury items also, that's sort of what I'm aiming for. And I think coming at it with where I come from, it actually worked out really well.
I would agree. That's a long journey, and there's a lot to unpack in
Yes.
a bunch of those
Yeah.
topics. But I think it's interesting that both on BAT and just elsewhere in the car world, you do get people that are sort of dyed in the wool car people, and
Completely.
they're suspect of new voices. They're suspect of
Yes.
voices that don't know as much as them. They're suspect of people with a different perspective than them or from a different title, right? Like a lot of people, some people
Yes.
read Bloomberg, some people don't. Some people, like you say, read like deep car titles.
Sure.
Bloomberg's not one of those, but it
No.
is it serves a different audience and a different purpose completely. But the way that you've communicated and the way that I was going to say you were in a sort of external perspective, but you said 20
Mhm.
years ago. So you've been 20 years sort of, it's not like you're still this totally outside perspective, right? Like over that
Yes.
journey, I think you've kind of moved in and certainly seen a lot, but also kind of participated in your own personal way. So I've always found that compelling and refreshing and different because I've read a zillion road and track articles, right? And obviously
Sure.
I know the BAT community really well, who many of them are really deep in this, but there's actually
Sure.
a new flavor on BAT, given how sort of accessible we've made it and some trustworthy, I hope we have made it. There's people that are adjacent to the cars that are kind of checking it out or interested in it or
Yes.
telling their friends about it. And for the future of cars and for the sustainability of the kind of stuff that we do, I think that's super important. So I always try to quell the deep experts that are like, don't let them in or don't listen to that
Yes.
voice or that person doesn't know, the difference between an engine and this engine. It's like, that's cool. Like, what do they know?
Yes.
What's their take on this? And do you find that that's a point of view that's more pervasive, or do you find circles like that of people that are sort of adjacent to cars getting into it, or do you just run
Yes.
into a brick wall with a bunch of experts that don't want to talk to someone who hasn't restored an engine?
That's a great question. I think it's both. I think the answer is both and yes to all of that. I think number one, there are a lot of people who don't think they're interested in cars, but if they're presented with cars in the right way or in a certain way, they actually are very interested in cars. What I find is that a lot of people who don't consider themselves car people, they will tell you if they like a car or don't like a car. They will have a specific memory about the first car they drove or the car that their cool uncle drove or the car their high school boyfriend drove. They will still have emotional connections and memories to cars. And they'll have a very strong opinion about certain colors or certain models or even certain makes. And they will have connections to just car culture that they might not actually put together, but they actually are more interested in cars than they think. And I find that is true with a lot of my New York friends and with a lot of my women friends, to be honest. I mean, they don't consider themselves car people, but like they have very specific ideas about cars. So to your point about trying to be open and welcoming to lots of people, I totally agree, because the other side of it is I really think if your car is the most interesting thing about you, that's not a good thing. I find that in the real world, let's not forget cars are niche. Cars as a segment are much smaller than sports. They're much smaller than a lot of other things. Cars are still niche. So we can really take a deep dive and get like really dug in with our friends who are deep into cars. But really, like if you zoom out, big picture, cars are still really niche. So, socially, I don't find it fun to be around people who can only talk about cars. I like being around people who can talk about cars and talk about culture and talk about music and talk about food or whatever else, travel. So there is value in being able to go really deep, and I really lean on specialists and experts for me to help educate me as sources and as just educators and analysts. I depend on them, and you all listening who are those people, you have so much value to us. I'm not one of those people, but I try to my best to listen to them and to really understand. But it can't only be that. It has to be a mix, just like you say, because I tend to find that people who are really, really, really dug in any topic are kind of boring. I don't know if that will get me angry emails, but yes, I want to talk to you about cars, but I also want to talk about a million other things. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's both. I think it's really both. We need people who might only be peripherally related to cars. I mean, of course, there is a sensibility in the car world, I think, of there are some barriers that people put up about like whether you're a real car guy, whatever that even means. And it can be really, and it doesn't mean anything. Like it actually doesn't mean anything. It has
But
no
but people
meaning.
wanna but people wanna be the judge and jury of
Yes.
that all the
Yes, of
time. Yep.
course. Of
Yep.
course. And that can feel very intimidating to people.
Mhm.
So that's too bad. But, that's not me.
Yep.
I guess
Yep.
I would say.
Well, I
Yeah.
appreciate that, and I think you're an individual for sure, but you're also, I think, a sort of a signal of a meaningful swath of the population, and that's probably how they think about it as well. So I think it's super cool to talk about and think about, and that's why I read your writing to get that point of view, not because you're going to tell me about the specs on some deep,
Yeah.
crazy Fiat, but because you're going to give the sort of broader view, right, and a different
Yes.
perspective than mine, which is why I've enjoyed our conversation. So anyway, that's cool. And so how does that inform your work at Bloomberg and the types of articles that you're choosing, and like what you would, I'm sure you do a lot of work like, what's the next story going to be? Some of it is like, oh,
Sure.
the latest breaking sort of shiny thing, but you
Mhm.
also steer towards like, am I going to write about an event? Am I going to write about a car?
Yeah.
Am I going to write about a person? Am I going to write about what? How do you choose that?
Well, the number one thing is I don't want to bore myself because I know if I'm bored writing about something, then for sure people are going to be bored reading about it. So I have to be interested in it. I will say that I think my editors keep me really grounded in terms of what the Bloomberg reader might want to read, because my editors are all in New York. Most of them don't own cars. I've had editors who don't have a driver's license. So when I feel myself getting pulled really into like deep dives and like really deep into car culture, even stuff that I think is really cool and interesting, like some obscure car show or Ferrari or something that's like really obscure, but I'm actually like getting nerdy about it, even myself. My editors sometimes will be like, Hannah, nobody cares. Like, no, like on the broader spectrum, nobody cares. And that's good. Like, it's good to be reined in a little bit. But to answer your question about what we cover, it's a mix. It's really a mix. Of course, I want to tell stories that are unique. Certainly, if a thing has been covered in other publications, we certainly try not to. I mean, obviously, with car debuts and model launches and car reviews, we're going to have other people will be writing about that too. So obviously, the reporting mix is a mix of car reviews, but not every car. But we try to pick interesting cars, events, some racing, some Formula One, some auctions. I mean, I think auctions in the auction world is so fascinating. So I love my auction coverage, and there's so much money. I mean, going back to Bloomberg, it's a business publication. We talk about money a lot. I find the world of classic cars fascinating, and I find it driven a lot by money and ego, which is really interesting. So it's a mix. I mean, the number one thing is I really try to be mindful of readers' time and attention span, because I know my attention span is small, which is not a good thing. And just try to, like obviously be accurate, be fair, be truthful, and don't regurgitate whatever the PR is telling you. I think that's another big thing. Like, we're not in the business of putting out press releases. We're not in the business of making automakers and PR companies happy with us necessarily. We're in the business of telling the truth to our best understanding and what we can best discern. And I answer to my editor and to my readers. So I try to really, really follow that line as well.
That's super insightful, I think. But my mind does go a little bit to those crazy things they won't let you write about. We have some deep, weird stuff on BAT.
Uh-huh.
I'd get fired as a Bloomberg editor because I'd be like, Hannah, go for it. What's the
Yeah.
weirdo geek out thing that you're going to write about? It's super revealing and interesting, but I don't know. Maybe when you've got a library of those, I'd love to page
Or
through them.
Well, for the other side of that is like, the 20th variant of a 911, my editor's like,
Uh,
Hannah, like they're all the same. My eyes are glossing over. Like I really have to make a very strong case that like, no, we really do need to write about the ST. Like it really is different than, or we really need to write about this. Obviously the hybrid 911, it's on my mind because of the news this week. Like, no, trust me, this one is important. We really need to write about it. But some of the other variants, I get like kind of an eye roll because it's like, what? Yet another new 911? Wow. Looks the same as the other ones. It's also that kind of thing.
I love that. I'm actually in
Yes.
agreement with that. I'd be a good editor on that one because I'd be like, okay, we've
Yeah.
read the Porsche press release too. We're good.
Yes. Yes.
That
Yeah.
comes out
Yeah.
every
The we're
month.
good. That
Yeah,
no, nah, we're good. I
yeah.
get that a lot.
Yeah, that's really funny. Well, I'm excited about some things coming up that you would be writing about. Can you give us any teasers on some of the? I know you have had a
Yeah.
recent fascination with F1. You were in the Middle
Yes.
East, and then you wrote a recent one
Yes.
about Monaco, and then you've been writing
Yes.
other. Yeah, are you just sort of into it, or what's grabbing your
I'm
attention
sort
with
of
F1
into
stuff?
Well, okay, well, this is a perfect segue because back when the Austin GP started in I think 2012, I was at the inaugural race then. And that's when I was at Forbes. I was actually working for Forbes, and that was a massive fight to even let my editors have me go. So, like, this is an example of something that I personally have been interested in since 2012, which is F1 racing. But for years, I would get pushback that it's too niche, that it's like not Americans don't care. That's only European. Oh, it's too elitist. Like for years. So the only difference is now I can write about it. Like it seems like I'm writing about it more, which is true, but I'm telling you, I've been trying to write about it since at least the Austin race, and it's only in recent years that and I love my editors, but it's only in recent years that they've seen, and also Americans have changed as well. So they're not inaccurate in saying that, but like we've got a lot more readers now for it. But yeah, the Formula One race in Jeddah was amazing, and that was an interesting trip. I was really happy to go. And there's just so much money. I'm mindful of this Monaco story we ran last week about Monaco being in contract negotiations to renew the contract after 2025. It's a really big deal. There are rumors that Monaco is in danger of being dropped from the Formula One calendar, which would be a really big decision because Monaco is the crown jewel, really. I mean, I know the Brits might say Silverstone is, but I do think if Americans know one Formula One race, it's going to be Monaco. So it is a crown jewel. But my point is, Monaco pays around $20 million to host the race every year, and a country like Saudi Arabia pays $60 million. So Liberty Media is making a whole lot more money off of these new races and new locations, whereas Monaco really gets away with paying next to nothing relatively because it's Monaco, because it's the crown jewel. So I just find it fascinating, this tension between the old historic European glamorous elite F1 and the new modernized, greatly improved Liberty Media owned Formula One that is needing to generate profits. I think that's a really interesting story, and it's ongoing. And, you know, there are 3 F1 races in the US, 5 in North America. That's a lot. That's a lot. I know like Europe, it's a lot smaller space. And so you could kind of say, well, it's not that much compared to the races in Europe, but those are all still in different countries. So I just find the whole thing fascinating. So yeah, that's an ongoing story that I'm really following. I'm actually sort of beating the bushes this week, trying to figure out if we can get some more information about how those negotiations are going about Monaco. So I'll have to keep you posted on that. Um, I am looking forward to, I will be driving the new 911 GTS hybrid in June. I'll be going to Spain for that, so I'm really looking forward to that test drive. I mean, what do you think about that car, Randy? Have you had a moment to digest how it looks and everything?
Well, well, it's complex. I would say the
Yes.
emotions are complex. The car is complex. It's all just sort of complex, figuring out how this is going to work. Right? There's turbos, actual turbos involved, not just marketing calling it turbos. There's
There's a single turbo, I think.
is it one? Okay,
I think
there's
it's one big one.
that's going on. There's
Yeah.
obviously hybrid power. There's and it's in the GTS. It's not in the normal
Yeah.
one. It's not in that, right. It's like toe in the water. I think we all kind of knew this day is coming, right? And how they execute. And Porsche thoughtful. Porsche's very German. Porsche knows what they're doing.
Nothing's an accident.
Well, they're sitting on a gigantic mountain of money at the moment, right? Because they're
Yes.
very, very successful, and I knew that they were gonna, come up with some way, and they have figured out, right? They only wavered in the '90s for a little bit, but otherwise, they've always known the 911 is like their identity. So
Has to
they
be.
I'm very glad that they tried out full electric and hybrid in a million other ways, just figuring out before they weren't going to like screw around and experiment with the 911. That one was going to be after it's figured out. And like I
Mhm.
have, the first time I saw it, Taycan driving up the freeway or whatever, I mean, I was like, oh man, what are they doing? But that product's come along a long way. And then the 911, this GTS, I think it will be interesting. I'm not as much of a fan of the brand new shiny 992. I mean, I think the car's huge. I'm a little
It's
bit
very
more
nippy. I
more
mean,
into sort of svelte, or it's some of that's
uh-huh.
nostalgia. I mean, it's never going to be 1965 again,
Like
but
in
I mean,
993 era?
yes,
Uh-huh.
993, 996, which was the
Mhm.
stepchild for a long
Okay.
time.
Yeah.
The dimensions of that car I really like, and I understand how people don't want to get hit
Okay.
by a
You
Chevy
weren't
Suburban
bothered by
in one of
those
those.
headlights?
I'm bothered by a lot of it, but I'm talking about size
Okay.
wise,
Okay,
right?
okay. Okay.
But
Mhm.
man, I drove up the freeway behind like a shiny new 911 Turbo or something yesterday, and I was like, man,
Mhm.
that is a big car. That
It's
thing is
big.
big,
I know.
right? And it's cool when you're sitting in it, right? I've ridden
Yeah,
in
of
the new
course.
ones, and when you're sitting in it, you're like, wow, this is rad. It's roomy, and
Yes.
you feel safe, and you could feel safe going fast. But there were just really big cars. So I love product, and I love evolution, and I love forward thinking and engineering, all that sort of background that I came from in auto. And so I love that they're doing it. Is it a car for me that I'm going to run out and buy?
Yeah.
It's almost like I like the drivetrain idea, but the car that it's in, the new 911, like I'm not a guy running out to buy a new 911. It's just that's not me. But thankfully, they got plenty of other customers that will. So I think it'll be
Do
fine.
you do you think people, yourself or others that you talk to, care that there's not a manual version available in that GTS?
Honestly, I don't know. I don't know who's going to be the person that runs out and buys that, right? Like the super
Right.
track performance showy Porsche person, even the person that has like 12 Porsche, these people that are just like
Mhm.
super deep Porsche. I
Mhm.
don't think they're beaten down the concrete to go stand out in front of the dealer and order one of those. I think this is a little bit of a different customer, different use case,
Mhm.
commute oriented, global emissions minded, like forward thinking tech minded. Well,
Mhm.
and here in Silicon Valley, I think we're going to see a million of them, right? Because
Mhm.
a lot
And
of
that
people have.
buyer doesn't care about a manual transmission.
I'm sorry, that's where I was going. I should have answered more directly,
Yes.
but yeah, I don't think that buyer really cares. They probably drive an automatic in all their other cars too, right?
I think
And
that's a
so
good point.
yeah, I think that car, first of all, it's a stake in the ground. It's almost like a messaging play. I don't know how many they're going
Yes.
to make, but it's like a messaging play as much as it's we're going to go try to take the hybrid market or whatever. They don't really care about
Right.
that. They're making their move for the next 2 and 3 products that are going to come after this, that I think are
Yeah.
going to appeal to the stick shift folks that they
Sure.
pull over. So
Sure.
this one, I think that manual is less critical in this one.
I agree. And I see online, plenty of people complaining that it doesn't have a manual and really saying, oh, this is the end of things, blah, blah, blah. But you can still buy a manual 992.1. You can still buy plenty of other manual Porsches. If you don't want to buy a hybrid, don't buy it. I mean,
Yeah.
back to our other point, there's so many other options. I think you're right. Like the person that's going to buy this GTS is not going to be bothered. buy it.
Yeah.
But everyone loves to comment online.
Yeah, I mean everybody hyper focuses on manual versus not, and when's that going to go away, and all that sort of stuff. And
Right.
Porsche, if anybody's going to hang on as long as they possibly can,
Yeah.
I think it's going to be Porsche. I think Ferrari will fall before Porsche
Hmm.
does on obviously on manual shifting, and that's how it's playing out, right? And but I think the whole narrative of the future, having your GT3 RS for track activities, even though someday when that's not even on the street at all, that will be a manually shifted thing, and they'll be able to hold on to that for a long time. But in the hybrid models and these sort of transitionary street models, I think that the manual is going to go adios in many.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
So anyway, things are evolving, but I love that you get to go to Spain and do that. So that's a car
Yeah.
release. You talked about the F1 stuff, which is really fun. And a lot of these, man, we it's interesting that it's the beat that you cover, but it's also a lot of these themes we're talking about are these, sometimes they're the super deep, car person that is, cars in their blood sort of audience.
Yes.
But this next layer outside of that has always fascinated me. And that's
Yes.
what we're talking about. This person
And
that's
it's
going
a
to buy that
lot of
911.
people.
Well, the person
Yes.
that's into F1, I mean, you hear this too, so maybe you're not surprised, but I'm always surprised because people come to me and they're like, oh yeah, Randy, that's cool that you have a car auction or whatever, talking to people that actually don't care or know what BAT is.
That's hilarious.
But they say, oh, but I'm kind of into F1. And I was like, what? Like you're into what are you talking about? Like
Yeah. Do
you
they have
run
a
some other
driver that
business.
they like? Like what's the pull for them?
Sometimes it's personality based. Sometimes it's drive to survive. Often it's
Of
drive to
course.
survive.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, in my ESPN feed on my phone, right? I mean, I get like college baseball and I get
Yes.
like college football and I get F1, right? It's very accessible. It's like everywhere all of a sudden. And
Well, when
it's
Page
interesting.
6 is covering live from Monaco, Page 6, the New York
Yeah.
Magazine's like gossip pages that I read religiously every day, they have a whole section on reporting from Formula One Monaco. I'm like,
Crazy.
oh wow, this
Mainstream.
is completely. And I think also Lewis Hamilton has had a big role in pulling in fashion people, pulling in a more diverse crowd,
Sure.
a younger crowd. Like he hasn't done everything, but I honestly think he should be credited for a lot of it.
Yeah.
He
I'm a Lewis
really,
guy. I love that you're saying
yeah.
that because
Oh,
I'm
well,
actually down with that guy.
I'm very excited just to see how everything changes when he goes to Ferrari. I mean, that's going to be fascinating. That's going to shake everything up, I think. I hope.
I love it. I'm on the edge of my seat. So anyway, but I'm going to steer us away. We could talk about F1 apparently for 3 hours.
We'll save
but
that for a later date.
I'm going to steer us to a couple other things. First of all, people should know that you guys have a podcast at Bloomberg. You were kind enough to have me as a guest, but tell people what you're doing with that and why you're doing that.
Okay, the podcast is called Hot Pursuit. And I co-host it with my wonderful colleague, Matt Miller, who's on Bloomberg TV. He's a TV host. He has a show in the mornings at 9 a.m. Eastern. And Matt and I started the podcast last year just because we wanted to talk about cars, basically, like do what we're doing. It's great because Matt owns a Challenger. He's a big Mopar guy. His aesthetic is extremely different from mine. So he watches Indy. He thinks the Monaco Grand Prix nead's to go away. I love it. Yeah, he's a great foil. He's a big deadhead. He's a very interesting chap. So it's a weekly podcast where we just get together and we talk about cars, what we've driven, what's coming out new, where we're traveling, and we try to have interesting guests on as well. And you are one of our favorites for sure, Randy. It was a great chat.
Cool.
So
I'd love
really
to do
fun.
it again. Yeah, it is fun. I've been in the car driving back and forth to work, decided to listen to podcasts recently, and it's been on my rotation. It's been fun to listen to those. I've had some fun with that, but wanted our audience to know about it too, because it's a cool one. And changing subjects yet again, so something that I teased at the top of the hour, you are just back from Europe from a fun event over there. I don't know how much of this was for coverage or was for personal satisfaction or vacation, but an event that I want to go. So it's on my bucket list so desperately to go to the Villa d'Este Concours de Eleganza. Do I have the name right? This is basically the Concours on Lake Como, the European. Some people call it the European version of Pebble Beach, but I think it's meaningfully different than Pebble Beach. But probably the most prestigious or on the podium for most prestigious concours in Europe. Is that right?
Definitely. Yeah, so the Villa d'Este Concours d'Elegance is an amazing car show, and it's tailor-made for you, Randy, because it's organized by BMW, and every year BMW debuts a new concept, a new motorcycle concept. It is kind of like Pebble Beach in that it's like a beauty contest for classic cars. It's a car show, but it's a lot smaller. They only had about 50 classic cars, and most of these cars I hadn't seen because they tend to stay in Europe, which I love. So as an American going over, it was great because I got to see cars that I hadn't seen at every other car show in the US. But it's a lot smaller than Pebble Beach, and it's really only the one thing. So you know how like we spend hours in traffic and trying to park and walking a million miles in Monterey for different car events. Villa d'Este is just you're there. You're on the water, you're there. You look at, a couple dozen cars and then you have lunch. And then Simon Kitson, announces the cars as they roll past, and that's kind of it. And it's awesome. And the other thing that I really loved about it, besides seeing a lot of cars that I hadn't seen before because they're hidden in Europe, is that there on the Saturday, it is an exclusive, like it's expensive to buy a ticket and to get in. But on Sunday, it's open to the public and tickets cost only 19 euros. And people line the streets of this small town on Lake Como, and you can see all of the cars rolling through in the morning, going to the lawn. And it is really accessible, even though it sounds and feels elite, and it is elite. But it is still accessible, and it's not stuffy at all. It's just really comfortable and nice. I technically was there as a holiday, although it kind of felt like work. I was actually there because Magnus, my boyfriend, was there taking meetings with Pininfarina. So we were there. Pininfarina is based in Turin. So we got to, visit those offices and see some really old, cool parts of Fiat and that cool track on the top of the old Fiat factory, which was
Okay,
really cool.
that's where I was going next, but we
Yes.
can jump there now if you
Yes.
want.
Well, so technically I was there just as a plus one for that. I was technically on holiday, but of course I also attended the car show, and that was really fun. And yes, have you been to Turin, Italy?
I've been through
Okay.
the airport, I think, and I've been through some of the autostrada, but I haven't spent time.
Yes, I found it really nice. I hadn't been before, and it was really amazing. Dave, the designer from Pininfarina, really took us under his wing and showed us around, and we got to go. There's a really amazing automobile museum there. I can't say it in Italian, but it's like the Automobile Museum of Turin, basically, but in Italian. So we went there, and it was a really great museum. They have a Senna exhibit going on right now, and that was really well done. And then we went to the old headquarters of the Fiat factory that has a huge banked track on the roof of the factory where they used to test the cars. Magnus, of course, had known about it. I hadn't known about it. And you can buy a ticket and anyone can go up there and walk around, and there's a restaurant on the top. And it was really interesting. So it was technically a holiday, but there's a lot of car stuff in Turin that was really fun to see. I enjoyed it.
That's super cool. That building,
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen old black and white photo. I don't know if I've ever seen video, but I've certainly seen old photos of cars on the roof. They'd build them in the building
Yes.
and drive them upstairs
Yes.
and shake them down or whatever,
It's
right?
kind of insane. Yeah, I mean, there's not even really a guardrail or fence off the side of the roof. It's just like the track. It's crazy. I mean,
And it's
there's
like
a wall.
third floor, or this is like 10th
No, it's
floor,
the
or this is
top.
like what?
It's like the 10th floor. It's like
Oh my God.
maybe a 10 or 12-story building, and then it's just on the roof. And there is a wall that might be waist height. And that's it. It's amazing. But back to Villa d'Este, I really recommend going. Yes, it can be expensive, but also there are plenty of Airbnbs in the area where, I have done this before, and I spoke with friends there who did it. You can get an Airbnb there for a decent rate, especially if you go on the public day, or if you're just in town during that weekend. You're going to see some really amazing, obscure Italian cars from these brands that I don't even know. Serenissima, that was like some crazy Italian prototype brand in the 70s that had some really cool cars that looked like a Ferrari and a Lamborghini sort of smashed together. But it was great. And then, of course, you see Rolls-Royces there that only stay in Europe and don't come to the US. So I really enjoyed it and recommend it.
Cool. I've been watching it from afar for a long
Yeah,
time, and it's hard to figure it out until you do it. I kind of feel like you go the first time just to figure it out, and then the second time you go, maybe
completely.
you'll actually get it sorted. But your insight of sharing that the second day is very public and
The
inexpensive,
second
and
day.
I bet people don't even know that, right? I mean, I don't know
I
how
don't
well
think it's
they.
advertised. I
Yeah.
myself, yeah, and there's also the Furioso Concorso, I believe I'm saying that right, is also held simultaneously nearby. So there are some other smaller things that are really accessible. They're not really well advertised, but you're right. If you find someone who's gone before you to sort of go with or like coach you through it, it is really doable and it's just really pleasant. I think the fact that it's a little bit remote, it's about an hour from Milan and 2 hours from Turin. So it takes some doing to get there. The fact that it's a little remote means that it's just naturally not as crowded. And naturally, there aren't just a bunch of tourists and people passing through. It takes some doing to get there, which in the end is really nice because it felt a lot more relaxed.
Tell us about some of the coolest things that you saw there. I know there was the BMW prototype car that they had
Yes.
that you wrote about, but there's also other stuff.
Okay, Pininfarina, this is on the new side. Pininfarina has their Pura Vision concept SUV, which I thought was really cool. And they had shown that at Pebble Beach. You know, that company, I will say, is fascinating because they're operating like they're a startup, because Automobili Pininfarina is a startup, but they're pulling on this heritage of a 100-year-old coach and design house that has designed the most beautiful cars in car history. So I find it's a fascinating dichotomy. And yeah, that's it. They are taking the long view. Obviously now they're making electric hypercars. That's an electric SUV concept. But I also think they're not necessarily tied into that in the future. They could go any number of ways, not even fully electric. They could go hybrid. They could go back to combustion. So that was interesting on the old side of things. On the new side of things. On the old side, there was this Serenissima car.
That's the
You
second time
might,
you've said that name, and I have no idea
I
what you're
know.
talking about. I have no
You'll
idea
have
what
to
you're talking about.
Google it.
I'm
It's
gonna
like
Google it. I found it. I found it.
yeah,
I
yeah, the
found it.
Serenissima Agena. So this is an example of it's a 1967 Serenissima Agena that I had never seen, I'd never even heard of. And I'm not to your extent, Randy, but I'm exposed to a lot of cars now, and it really takes a lot for me to be surprised or shocked. And so I really loved seeing that because I hadn't seen it before. It's cool, it's interesting, it's extremely rare.
Wait, they're
So
saying
I
it's a 1967. Like, is this like
Yeah,
a new
67.
concept, or this is an old
No,
car that was built
it's
back
old.
then, one-off?
Yes, yes,
It
but it
kind of
looks it
for
it
those
looks
listening,
completely
it
new.
kind of looks like a Mura meets a Pantera
Yes.
meets
Yeah, Pantera is a good one.
I don't know. Vallelunga is the first De Tomaso. It kind of looks like that car. It's like a
Yes.
rear engine Italian looking swoopy cool sports car.
Yeah, it's cool. It's cool. And it's just an example of like extremely obscure, rare. I had never seen it. And the other great thing about this show, which like Pebble Beach, the cars are running. The cars move. They drive the cars. They had that car in the streets. So I loved seeing it. I love seeing it in motion and not just in like a warehouse somewhere or a museum. It was out in the open, which I loved. And then the other car that I really love seeing, and I admit that I'm a little bit biased toward Rolls Royces because I own one. But there was this 1933 Rolls-Royce 4050 Phantom 2. And this Rolls-Royce looked like a hot rod, which is a really weird thing to say. It's a super early Rolls-Royce, 1933, and the proportions of it look like a hot rod, like an American style hot rod from Orange County, which was really interesting because I talked with Anders Warming, who's the designer of Rolls-Royce, and he mentioned that car is internally the car that they reference a lot on the design team because of the proportions. And he used this term sheer monolithic beauty. And the idea is that like it's a block. It looks like a cliff of a car, basically, with a super, super flat roof, super narrow windshield, and just a massive vertical grille, massive hood. It was very interesting. And to hear Anders tell me that that car was important to him as a designer, as a reference point, I thought that was really interesting. And that was another car that had gone to the US. That one is owned by Mr. Bamford of the UK. So he doesn't like to send that car around a lot. So that was another one that I really liked. And of course, it had really classic, cool two-tone paint, like a really cool sort of aubergine burgundy with black with a really cool red pinstripe going through it, which was perfectly executed celebration of color that it would be really difficult to pull off. You know, like color on cars is such a tricky thing. And when you see one that is really stunning, but it's done well and it doesn't look outre, it just looks really nice, that's tough to do. So I was really impressed by that as well.
Cool. Those are some deep cuts. I
Yeah,
like
those are really
like, I go to Google. Like when you start talking about those, I'm going like those are cars either I don't know or I certainly haven't seen in person. So this
yeah.
show brings out sort of
Yes.
hidden, crazy,
Yes.
one-off, interesting stuff.
Also, I'll say there was I think it was a 67 or 68 Maserati, and I'm not going to remember the model name, but it had a completely suede interior, and it was driven by a couple from Amsterdam who they didn't drive it to Como, but they had recently taken it on some long drive. They're very proud of that. But the whole interior was brown suede, like a suede that you would wear in a bomber jacket or something,
Crazy.
and in perfect condition. I've never seen that. And the interior, including the dashboard, the door panels, this roof, like all of it, not just the seats. And it was like extremely soft suede, like a glove.
Wow.
I mean, I've never seen that. It was really cool. I liked it.
That's fun. Kind of blurring into the fashion world like you're talking
completely.
about, right? Materials and that
this
sort
is
of stuff.
This is from the 60s. Like it goes back to the thing where almost nothing is new in this world, you know, even with the Serenissima. It looks like kind of a modern car, and it's a 67, which by now is old.
I've only found
Kind of
one
cool.
sort of side profile pic of that online. I'm going to try to find some more pics and look at that white car. It looks pretty interesting. I'd like to know what the heck it is because I
know
this is the first I'm hearing of it. Speaking of cars, just want to hear a little bit. I mean, you write the car beat, but you also have some interesting cars. You just referenced a Rolls-Royce that you have. I know you have a dirty little secret about Corvettes that you like.
What? Is that shameful? Is that a shameful thing?
No, I tease you a little bit about the whole C3 thing. I mean, I talk about, you were joking me about 996s being a stepchild for a while, or design elements. C3s were like the bottom of the barrel for a long time. And now
they're coming back up.
Love them. They've come back up. They're not just coming back up. They've come back up, right? For some of the special ones. And you're into a certain sort of era of car or types of cars, and a couple of these you have and actually spend time with. Could just give our audience a little overview of that, because it's not all Serenissimas or whatever we're talking about, right? It's not all Rolls Royces out there. There's some cool stuff right here in LA and New York that you like to drive around. Is that right?
Completely. Yeah. I mean, I just want to drive something that's interesting, and so many things today are not interesting. So again, like, don't be boring. I want to have something around me that's interesting that I'm excited to get in. So I have a 75 Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow long wheelbase that is in sort of an olive green with a Brazilian brown interior, which is a wonderful car. And I didn't even mean to get it. It's not an expensive car. I basically swapped it for a Mercedes SL plus like $2,000 cash. It was like a impromptu thing that turned out great. And that opened the door to me for like, wow, Rolls Royces can be had for not a lot of money. Now, we're aware of the saying, there's nothing as expensive as a cheap Rolls Royce. This is true. But I also think a lot of the talk about the expense of maintaining and repairing a Rolls Royce is not necessarily true. I think the important thing is to keep driving it. And I drove it to work today. I've driven it to work every day this week. I really drive that car. Yes, it's important to have a good mechanic, and Charlie Agapu, of course, in LA is my guy. He's great. But it's really been a really wonderful experience. So I have that, and then the 77 C3 Corvette in powder blue, which I love. It is an automatic, and that car is not fast. It's a tin can. It rattles. The interior is like this Naugahyde blue, and I feel that it doesn't get enough respect because it's very cool. It's just like contrarian and obnoxious, and I love it because it's just like the punk kid to me. Nobody, when I drive the Rolls-Royce, people give the thumbs up and they love it. And that the Rolls-Royce, if I pull up at any number of, fancy hotels or restaurants, it's always parked out front because the valets know it and they love it. The Corvette gets no respect. Like, they shove it in the back. It's basically a used car to them. And I'm personally offended on behalf of the Corvette because it gets no respect. And I'm like, a friend of mine, I said, I'm not getting any attention in this Corvette. What is wrong? And he just said, take the T-tops off. Then you might get some attention. So sometimes I take the T-tops off just to get people to respect it. But it's a struggle. It's a struggle, but it's tough being a thought leader. And what can I say? The Corvette will come around. I firmly believe. I have to believe it.
The C3 in particular. I love that. I love
the
it.
C3.
When I'm in LA, I'm going to be looking around. You say nobody notices it. I got to be skeptical on that. I'm sure somebody notices.
I'm not getting the
Did
respect.
you think powder blue driving around?
Yes.
You driving around a powder blue Vet in LA? You're like, no attention.
No,
I would think
people
you'd
just
be
hate
like,
it. No,
oh,
they
gosh.
just I know, that's what I'm saying. Do you have a C2?
I had one. I restored a C2 and sold it on the website. It was sort of a project that we did back when I thought doing project cars online for people to watch and scrutinize was a good business model. It was a terrible business model. And I was like, we're probably never going to do this in this way again. And we got like a small sponsorship to do it that we ended up gobbling up in the first 2 weeks. And it was a terrible business model, but it was fun. I restored it with my dad and we drove it, and it looked very cool, but it was one that was just sort of destined to be passed along. But I would do another Vet for sure. And I actually like C3 Vets.
Too.
I like the chrome bumper early through C3 Vet.
Obviously the chrome bumper is preferable. Mine is not even a chrome bumper. It's not even that. It's like truly terrible and wonderful. Yeah, chrome bumper for sure would be a positive. I also have to say the modern Corvette is great. I think it's the C8. It's a lot of car for the money. It looks cool. Half the time, if I see it out of the corner of my eye, I think it's a Ferrari. I thought it was a great car, great value. Not wild about the interior, how it's like divided by this huge Berlin Wall down the center of the seats. But I thought it was a great car. I'd own that too if I was into owning new cars.
There you go. There's a bunch of those running around, but those we sell a lot of those on BAT, as you know. But anyway, both of those are some funny stories. I appreciate you sharing those with us. So you got a couple of those, and I'm sure you get press cars and modern cars and are running around and stuff. But I just think that people's decisions that they make of what they're actually going to slide their card for and drive around in and be willing to repair in the case of the Rolls-Royce and that sort of thing, the pain tolerance.
I'll tell you what I'm looking for.
I think it's interesting. Oh, are there more things on the list?
Yes. If you know of anyone, and I do have my Bring a Trailer alerts set to this model, but there are not many that come up.
Ooh,
I want a Camargue.
Oh,
Rolls-Royce
really?
Camargue.
Okay.
The only Pininfarina designed Rolls-Royce, the only Rolls-Royce with the grille that actually slants forward.
That's right.
Which is an interesting design. And people love it or hate it. I've driven a few and been in a few. Drives like a dream. I just think they're really cool and unusual. And I think they made fewer than 600 of them. So they're actually relatively rare.
Yeah, I think the rarest thing is that you just said you've been in a few of them. Like, I think I've ever seen one of those. You've been in a few of those.
I've been in a few.
Those are very unusual. We've listed, go ahead and sign up for alerts, but those only come up once every year if we're lucky.
They
don't come up that often.
I know. So yeah, if you know of anyone, let me know. I got some ready cash
Oh, look
available.
out, look out. Does
I
that
mean,
mean that the other roles goes, or is this
no,
are you
no, no, no,
expanding you're
no.
expanding the, repertoire here?
I would make space for the right one. For the right one, I would create space.
A lot of
This
people don't
is
even know
LA.
that that edition exists. It's a two-door coupe
Yes.
hardtop type body style, right?
Yes.
And it has that
Yeah.
funky grille. I don't know too much beyond the
Now,
styling component, but
some of them they sold terribly, and so some people chopped the roofs off because they
mm,
thought it would be better, which is a disaster aesthetically and engineering wise. So I'm not interested in buying a convertible Camargue for anyone who's listening. I know how that went, and that was not a good thing. But yes, the original with the roof intact. That's what I'm looking for.
all right. Well, I will keep an eye out. I'm sure somebody out there listening knows where there's one or will list one on BAT. So keep your eyes and ears open, everybody.
Yes.
Thanks for
Email
sharing that.
me.
I love hearing
Yeah,
people sort of hopes and dreams of what they may
that's
end
what I
up
want.
tripping
That's my
across.
hope and dream.
So anyway, fun to hear. Hannah, I'm going to wrap it there. I definitely want to give you a plug, obviously, for your work at Bloomberg. People can follow you and see you there, and the podcast that we mentioned, which is super fun. But thanks so much for giving me a second chance to interview you. You were very gracious
Always.
in that, and I'm sure that we'll do it again, and people will want to hear more about these stories and the interesting stuff you're covering.
Thank you,
So
Randy, so much. It's really been fun. I'll talk cars with you anytime.
fantastic. We'll do it again. Thanks everybody for listening to the BAT podcast, and stay tuned for the next one. We'll talk to you soon.